Hi, I'm Amber Mack. Thank you so much for joining me today. Today, I am in conversation with Senator Colin Deacon, who is a senator from Nova Scotia, and we are going to chat about a new survey report that has just come out that is talking about how to leverage mobile phone data in terms of doing more to essentially plank the curve with COVID-19. Hello, Senator Deacon.
Great to chat with you, Amber. Thanks for reaching out. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for being here. So let's get started and dive into this report and the findings. So maybe we can start with why you decided to do this report. What was the purpose behind this?
Well, there was increasing discussion about the use of contact tracing apps internationally and in Canada, and then we also saw Alberta just recently launched the use of one. And there's a real intersection between privacy and technology and health and our economic situation with this question. So it seemed to be something that cut across a lot of spheres where no one group would necessarily take it on. And we wanted to look at it from the perspective of what were Canadians thinking about this? What were their concerns? What were their fears? What would motivate them to use it or not? And so we really wanted to explore that. I worked with two of my colleagues, Senator Rosemary Moody, who is a pediatrician who spent a lot of time in that field and is globally respected and lived through the SARS epidemic in Toronto. And so his firsthand experience about what this looks like from the inside. And Senator Donna Daskal, who spent her life in polling and using public opinion information to inform and perhaps shape as well public policy. So it was a great team effort to look at this.
I would also say that it is a good time to ask tough questions. We know that Canadians need some light at the end of the tunnel. You know, we were just talking earlier on about the jobs report and unemployment. 3 million Canadians have lost their jobs. When we look at the number of deaths due to COVID-19, we're looking at more than 4,000 Canadians. So it is time to have these tough conversations. So maybe we can start there. You know, there's a lot of opinion surrounding this conversation of contact tracing apps.
Yeah, and for me, I think the real motivator is how do we get Canadians to the point where they can safely get back to work? You just feel it with everybody you talk to in your communities. I live in rural Nova Scotia, but I don't care if you're downtown Toronto, where you are. People want to get back to work. They want to get a chance to move on from where we are right now. And practically, this period we're in right now is not sustainable economically, socially, in terms of mental health, in terms of just about any factor you look at. It's not sustainable. So we've got to find a way to start to open up our economy in a way that people feel safe. I mean, this week there's been a lot of publicity about the meatpacking plant workers in Alberta and their fears about going back to work. You can't have employees and you can't have Canadians being fearful all the time and have a properly functioning economy or have a chance to get going. So we've got to find a way to manage that. And for me, the use of technology in some way, shape, or form, in combination with really good privacy, managed with really good privacy controls, is something that's got to be looked at. It's got to be considered.
I couldn't agree more. And I think at the end of the day, when we talk about using these apps, they can be used in so many different ways. There can be so many different organizations that are involved. But at the end of the day, there are things that can be done right. Before we talk a little bit more about that, I would love to talk about the survey findings. There were 6 different findings. And perhaps we could walk through them, starting with the first one in terms of the number of Canadians that believe that it will be necessary to continue with contact tracing.
Yeah, and really high numbers on the basics that have been preached extremely well by our Prime Minister and by our public health officers across the country, by certainly in Nova Scotia, our Premier, stay the blazes home. I mean, it's, people have really picked up and know what we have to do. And contact tracing is one of them, for sure. 90% of Canadians know that contact tracing is crucial to controlling the spread of this disease, of the pandemic. But I don't think there is a good portion that we're not aware that this is done in analog form right now. Contact tracing right now involves people recalling where they've been and then reaching out and trying to individually find everybody associated. And I received an email this week saying, "Hey, were you in this building at this time? Because if you were, you may have been exposed." So I think a more reliable way of exposure notification would be really, really helpful to Canadians, as long as their privacy can be protected. And that came through. But Canadians absolutely know that contact tracing is critical here.
And what's really interesting in terms of the second finding is that 80% of Canadians support the use of mobile phone data by public health officials. So we've seen that there is large support in terms of using this data that could be shared in an anonymous way on our phones. And in fact, I was reading a study from Oxford University that says that we only need 60% of people to sign up for these apps for them to be successful.
And there was, I think, CBC Spark had an interview last week with the group involved with Mila in Montreal, and they said that from their standpoint, their approach to this can be as effective as a vaccine once 60% are using it. So you've got to look at this, and it may be ruled out for various reasons, but it's got to be examined. And for me, understanding what the concerns of Canadians are is crucial.
Absolutely.
But 80% said that they would look at using this app. Absolutely.
What I find really interesting, too, when I mentioned on social media that we were going to have this conversation around contact tracing apps, like I mentioned, there are always questions about privacy, many people who are against them, and I totally support those people. I think
Absolutely.
Individuals have a right to say, I do not want to use this, but I also have a right to say that I would use this to protect the people around me. And I think that's where we have to have this common understanding, is that it doesn't have to be mandatory for it to work.
Absolutely does not. We decided to ask that question just to see, because in some jurisdictions it is mandatory. I was surprised that 65% said that they would recommend it being mandatory. That was actually amazingly, Amber, it was the same level as the group that would say they'd take the vaccine if it was available. So it was a surprising level of support for mandatory use. That's not recommended by our privacy commissioners. They just came out with information about this yesterday. So this is an evolving situation. But for me, what's really important to remember is that a lot of us are really seeing our rights curtailed right now by having to stay home, by not being allowed to open our businesses. There's a lot of ways that right now in our current situation, we're really being restricted in fundamental ways in our lives. And so this is an alternative that has to be explored to perhaps start to lift those restrictions. That's the way I look at it.
Was there anything aside from that number of 65% of Canadians who said they would be okay with mandatory use of these apps? Was there anything else that you discovered throughout this process that surprised you?
For me, that was the biggest surprise by far. Absolutely the biggest surprise, and it's not something I recommend. But it was. I'm really glad we asked the question, because it gives you a sense of where people are at. The other elements are, I think, the awareness of and broad belief that only certain groups should have access to this information. Total support for physician, public health, family, and slightly less health researchers, but complete support for them to have access to testing data. Without a doubt. That's really fantastic. What was also really nice to see is that Canadians would like to have exposure notification themselves. They would, that they've been around someone who's tested positive, but at the same rate that they would like other Canadians to be notified if they were the tested positive. So that said something about Canadians in my mind.
You know, it really strikes me that we are in some ways perfectly set up to use contact tracing apps in Canada. We have trust in government and governmental organizations for the most part. Many countries don't necessarily have that. We have quite a savvy tech population in terms of the number of people using new technologies, and it's quite an innovative country as well. So. And I should also say that it's not as though we would be starting from scratch. I mean, there have been many countries around the world that have been leveraging these apps and that have been successful.
Well, I think the critical element is managing privacy. I mean, does data leave your phone? If it does, is it encrypted and is it anonymized? How is that data used by whom? Those are critical questions, absolutely critical questions. And again, the privacy commissioners, and we can make sure that your community is aware of the privacy commissioners federally, nationally, right across the country. Their report that they put out yesterday. But if those concerns are addressed, I think there's a real willingness. Again, still, is that the right thing for us to do? I look at it when I trade off the various elements. We've got to consider it. We absolutely have to consider it.
I would love you to comment on this because as I was researching this topic, and I've been talking a little bit over the past few weeks about contact tracing apps and just trying to wrap my head around it and being sensitive to people who are worried about privacy, it strikes me that there are three things that we need for this to actually work. One is, of course, consent and trust. And I think you touched on this in terms of these apps must be voluntary. And the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada, just yesterday, like you mentioned, had encouraged that. Number two is that we need to really control who verifies those positive cases. That seems essential as well. We don't want anyone to be able to go into this app and say they have COVID-19 when they don't. And the third I heard on the 2020 Network podcast where they were talking about data sharing and they encouraged having a sunset clause. So at some point,
absolutely,
this information is no longer shared. So if you think about those three things, to me, it seems like a much more reasonable approach to embracing these apps.
Well, and also it's not, I think for the most part, these apps are not storing your data for the entire time they're on your phone. They're storing the data for the previous 14 days. And it's on a rolling basis. So all of those sorts of controls absolutely have to be in place, because if this is sort of an Orwellian Big Brother kind of approach, it's not going to work. If this information goes straight to the police, for example, it's not going to work. And I would just correct you on one thing. I think people's trust in public health right now and our awareness of the importance of our public health officials and public health network is more important now than ever. And those individuals continue to earn the trust of Canadians every day. And so I think if they are seen to be the group that is responsible for evidence-based reasons, and they're concerned about protecting health first, yours and those of your family and community and Canadians, then I think that there's going to be a lot of support as long as the design of the software, the design of the app reflects that.
And I believe just from hearing from experts, like you said, it is possible to anonymize the data. It is possible to make sure that none of that information gets shared. And I'm not sure if you saw this, but Toby from Shopify shared this cartoon on his social media account where he talked about how these apps could get up and running and how they could work. And it is essentially a cartoon that he shared that is in the public domain where it explains how privacy-first contact tracing works, and it walks through the process of information being shared, how an individual would then potentially get a code from their doctor or the hospital to verify that they did test positive for COVID-19, how that information could be shared with people around them without any personal information being shared, and how at the end of the day that could protect more people because of the efficiency of that process. So I guess I bring this up because we know that there are people with deep tech expertise who understand that this can be done. And there's always a few privacy voices across the country that tend to be the loudest that I believe in many ways stop us from progress in certain areas. And I'm not saying privacy isn't important, it absolutely is, and we need to be safe. But we cannot allow more people to die when we know that we could do this right.
Well, and we can't continue to have our economy shut down. Where we are right now economically is not sustainable. And so privacy is one, I just like to reach out. What drove me to this question more so than anything was, we've got to look at privacy in this country more. I think at a higher level or a stronger level or a more comprehensive level than we have in the past, because the reality is, there's a lot of estimates. Forbes magazine did an estimate that 90% of all data in the world was generated in the last 2 years. You think about the streams of data coming off of our devices at every second. They are going somewhere. They are being used by different groups. All of our banking data, whatever else out there that is being generated, it is being stored. It is being used. So getting transparency around that, understanding who's using it, who has it, whether or not they're serving my interests or somebody else's interests as a generator of those data, is a really important question. So that what I like about studying this issue right now is that Canadians, even when they're feeling as vulnerable as they are today, are still concerned about privacy. That is crucial. And so we've got to get a handle on how do we protect the privacy of Canadians, while at the same time empowering our economy to be as globally competitive as possible, because we've got to find a way to pay for all this debt that we've generated in a very short period of time that's going to be with us for a very long period of time.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think there's another thing we haven't quite touched on, and that is the topic of transparency. And as someone who covers the tech world and is often trying to explain to people how technology works, I can say that the majority of the public does not understand very often exactly how technology works and how data is shared. So I think that if this could be done in a transparent way, where the information that's being shared could be explained in a easy and simple way for people, that this could be successful. Although I would say also over the past couple of months, there have been things explained in terms of public health about whether you're allowed to go for a walk or not that have confused everybody. So I think that's where we missed the mark.
Without question, Amber. And it's, this has been an absolutely extraordinary period. The extent to which our lives have been transformed in the last 2 months is almost incomprehensible. The reality is we've just got to look at every tool possible to start to get us out of this. And privacy is not just important right now in terms of a discussion. Good privacy first policy or privacy by design policy is not just something we need to talk about right now. It's something we need for the future. So I'm with you entirely on the whole front. Thank you. I'm just so glad that somebody like you, though, is out there really pushing these issues, as you have been for quite a while, because that's why I was excited to get my colleagues in the Senate interested in this issue, because it's so real, it's so current, it's so urgent, and it's got long-term implications.
Absolutely. And if we're talking about life after the pandemic, and I realize that that could be a couple of years away, I think one of the things that has always concerned me is the reality that we're in right now in terms of how fearful people are about sharing data. And just for a minute, I'll share a story. I was talking to a woman who is the head of AI at Sick Kids Hospital in Toronto while we were doing the AI Effect, a podcast series that I hosted a couple of years ago. And I will never forget her comments where she said to us that more and more parents were coming in and not wanting to share information or data about what their children were experiencing because they were so concerned that data would be leaked. So they always opted out of sharing that data. And she said her biggest concern was that lives were going to be lost because we didn't properly understand how data could be anonymized. So this is a topic not just that we have to address in Canada over the next few months. This is a conversation we have to get on the same page about for the coming years, because we need to understand privacy by design.
Absolutely. And I look at it, the example I give all the time is, imagine our highways if we didn't have lines on the road, if we didn't have rules of behavior and controls and guardrails and other elements. It's the same thing with managing privacy. There is a way for us to have vehicles passing each other at a combined speed of 200, and more kilometers per hour. There's a way for us to do that safely, and we can safely use very private information in a way that benefits individuals and also benefits a collective group in some way, shape, or level. So we've got to get it sorted out because the data is being generated right now. It is being stored. We don't know how it's being used for the most part. But think about all the information off of our social media platforms, our banking, our telecommunications, our vehicles now are generating massive amounts of data. So we really need to, as a country, embrace a revisitation of our approach to privacy.
100%. I mean, especially as we move into this world where we have things such as autonomous vehicles where they're going to be talking to each other and sharing data to protect us. I mean, the list of reasons we have to start to wrap our heads around this in a logical and evidence-based ways is
growing exponentially.
Absolutely. Listen, I do want to thank you again for your time. I know that you have tweeted out the report findings, so people can find that on your social media account. I will also share it online. And I wanted to thank you for all the work that you have done in this space and thank your colleagues as well. And thanks for having this conversation. Again, it's time to have these difficult conversations. We're in a bad place, and there are ways that technology can help. It's not the whole solution. It's just a piece of it.
Without question. Hand washing, pretty basic, right? That's an old technology. It's still working.
Absolutely.
Yeah. No, thanks, Amber, very much.
Thanks so much for being here and having this conversation. And thank you to everybody who is watching along. Please share this video if you know anyone who's interested in this topic. And as always, if you have questions or comments about the contact tracing apps and concerns, which I'm sure many of you do have, please leave me a comment across social media and I will do my best to get to it. Thanks for watching and most importantly, stay safe.